Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I want to introduce to you today our speaker for today's um, author's talk is Mr. B. Lance Jenkins. He is a writer, speaker, and businessman in the greater North Carolina Piedmont Triad area and the co-founder of the Richmond Observer, a daily local news publication in Richmond County, North Carolina. He studied history at Chowan University and performed as a member of the community chorus, where he was inspired to include Mozart's Requiem as the central theme in his debut novel, A New Requiem. Please help me welcome B. Lance Jenkins.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, this reminds me of my teaching days. I was actually a college professor for about 4 years. I probably look, well, I feel young, so that's good, but I'm 32, so I did it at a very young age. But right out of my master's program, I taught in the evenings political science. So to be able to talk to such a young crowd today is rather refreshing because I don't get to do that much. But so this is going to be kind of a question and answer type thing, and I might interact with you guys if that's okay, walk around the room. Hope that's okay too. But so what class are you guys in right now that you typically would be in? Seminar, okay. So how old are you guys? Oh wow, okay, so that's really neat. And I understand if this is not true, then don't hurt my feelings and say it isn't, but I understand you took a vote to be here today. Thank you for taking a vote to be here today. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your time. I hope you'll find this interesting. So, how many of you would like to write for a living? You hadn't quite figured that out yet. We got one in the back. There we go. And right here, yeah, that's really neat. I've written for a long time. I have actually been writing, I'd say, since the 4th grade. In 4th grade, I wrote a little short story with a friend of mine called Glory. It was some cheesy story about an eagle who had friends in the woods, and really no plot to it, but it was fun. And then I wrote a story about my history teacher and my English teacher in, I guess it was 8th grade. You ever heard of Beavis and Butthead? Bet you didn't think you'd hear that today in today's book talk. But anyway, they had a movie that I modeled this story about my English and history professor on. And so my English teacher actually let me read it to the whole class over a 5-day period. That must have been the least interesting thing my fellow students had ever dealt with. But nonetheless, I had the opportunity to write, and I loved writing. And so, many of you have ever read George Orwell's Animal Farm? Yeah, one of my favorites. Very short, but Animal Farm actually was the inspiration for the first spoof film project I ever participated in, called the Blair Pig Project. How many of you ever heard of the Blair Witch Project? Animal Farm? A spoof, like a making fun of something. That's a good question. So like making fun of something. So we're kind of making fun of. Animal Farm was really a big piece of American literary culture when it was written. It was also, the same author wrote the book 1984. You ever heard of that? So that's a very iconic piece in American literature. And so I was inspired at a very young age to write. And so in college, I was a history professor, a history major. Wow, getting ahead of the game, and wrote a lot in the history program. But I didn't get to write for fun. You know, there's something different. I mean, I enjoyed research. You enjoy writing for school, but you would much rather do something that interests you particularly, right? And so for me, I always wanted to write fiction. So in 2015, I was on the beach in Hawaii. And you should be relaxing, but that's not who I am, unfortunately. And so I decided that I wanted to finally put this passion to the test and write a novel. And so you see it in front of you. But that's not where I started. And since we have a younger audience here today, I'm going to tailor a lot of what I talk about in the book about how to achieve dreams. I think that's something I'd like to talk about today, if you're okay with that. I wrote 100 pages in 2015, that week on the beach. Now, if you write 100 pages in something, tell me, guys, you want to finish the project, right? I mean, because you really don't want to do that much work and it not come to fruition, yeah? Well, I didn't like it, so I quit. The whole thing, 100 pages in. And then I tried again. Got about 50, 75 pages in, and I quit. And Teresa, who's just up here speaking to you, Ms. Teresa will tell you that is quite a commitment to just quit and go that deep in. And so finally, after about 3 failed attempts, in 2017, late 17, I came up with a concept for this book. And that's the interesting part, so we'll get to that. And it's called A New Requiem. And how many of you ever heard what a requiem is? All right. Yeah, okay, cool. So it's often used in pop culture now for things that are deathly or gloomy. But Requiem was a concert by Mozart back many, many years ago. Now, why does that pertain to this? This book has nothing to do with Mozart or Requiem, but the themes behind Requiem are very evident in this. So let's get down to it. What is this about? Isn't that what you want to know? She's like, yeah, I've been trying to get to that for 5 minutes. So, all right, so let me tell you what it's about. It's about a 17-year-old boy in a small fictional town in North Carolina who was murdered. And how a man who is the community chorus director is wrongly accused of the crime, and how the town turns against him so quickly. Now, the fundamental thing you need to know about why the town turns against him so quickly is because he's gay. And so this is in this small, very radically, fundamentally conservative not being a bad thing, but radically and fundamentally, am I saying that's bad? Perhaps. But very, very extremist ideologies in this town. And because he's a gay man in a town where that is not accepted, he's immediately convicted in the court of public opinion. And so that really hits home with something that's very fundamental argument going on today. How do we treat people who are different than what we're used to and what our social norms are? I think that's very pertinent to the time. I grew up in North Carolina, northeastern North Carolina, a very small county, Northampton County. Y'all ever heard of that? Well, I'm not surprised that most of you haven't, because it's much smaller than Rockingham County. And you think to yourself, how could it be smaller than Rockingham County? Trust me, it's out there, I promise. I mean, when I moved to Reidsville, actually, I work at the Farm Bureau, and I saw that we had a Bojangles in town. I thought, goodness, I have arrived. You know, this is the real deal. This is the big city. And so, ultimately, I've always lived in small towns, is my point. And so my experience in small towns really inspired the story behind this. Now, where I grew up, a small town called Jackson, is not really, I didn't really experience the same things there. But I've seen the ugliness I described in this book everywhere I've lived in some facet. And it inspired this message that I'm very passionate about. That perhaps we ought to consider how we treat others different than us. And I think that's a message that anybody could take in. If you're a Christian, like I identify, if you're of any race, ethnicity, or religion, I think that is something that's pertinent. And so when I wrote this, you know, you write your first book. If you ever decide you want to write a book, here's what you're going to do. You're going to say, oh gosh, I've got this great idea, and it's going to change the world. I'm pretty sure I said that at one point. The reality is that the publishing business and the writing business is very, very difficult to navigate through. And so oftentimes you've got something great to say, and nobody actually will hear you unless you really, really work hard to get the message out. Sometimes it still doesn't work. And so for me, I decided that this isn't perfect, but I'm going to put it out because I want to achieve this lifelong goal. How many of you have a lifelong goal? Yeah, you've got something that is absolutely the most important thing you could achieve in your life right now. For me, at 30, I guess, years of age, that was writing this book. And I want to tell you that it was inspired by somebody in real life. The man who's wrongly accused in this book, his name is Dwight Carey. He's a 69-year-old man, very long-time member of the community. He was inspired by somebody in real life named Dwight Barry. He was a good friend of mine. Now, he was never accused of murder. I told him in late 2017 that I was writing this book with him as the inspiration for one of my major characters. And he didn't quite know all the details yet, but he was really honored. He passed away 6 months later of lung cancer. He never actually read the book. But I want to tell you how I got to know him, so you'll understand why I'm so passionate. And then I'll do some reading. How about that? And answer questions too. And prepare your questions. You can throw them at me hard. I'll take them. It's not a White House press conference, but we'll have fun, okay? So Dwight and I met in 2010, and he was a very, very talented musician, an organist, a pianist. How many of you played the piano? Anybody in here play the piano? Yeah, I envy you. I've always wanted to. I'm sorry? You know one song? That's more than I know, so congratulations. Yeah, that is wonderful. And so I've always wanted to do that, and I have never heard anybody play like this in person. He was just a talented musician. And he lived in a small town where being gay was not exactly accepted, to say the least. Everybody treated him great. I mean, he was talented. He was a contributor to the community. Everybody loved him. But the reality is, at the core, at face value, he was different than them. And that just always was what wasn't. It bothered me to see people treat him in a way that I didn't think any human being ought to be treated because of their identity. And so over the years, we would spend time having dinner after. We actually went on this wedding tour. It was crazy. I would sing and he would play, and we just became great friends. And so, in large part, I saw his struggles that oftentimes he wasn't very vocal about. You know, people that feel like they're outcast often aren't very vocal about how they feel, are they? And so the passion for that subject was instilled in me through meeting him. And that's why I wanted him to be an inspiration for one of my characters. And there's no, you know, a lot of times people say writers lean on what they know. And if you write a book one day, you'll probably lean on life experiences to develop that concept. I'll tell you that almost nothing in this book was inspired by real life other than him and that character in this story. But that character, to me, was the Dwight Barry I knew in real life. I tried to convey that on paper. So if you ever read it, I hope you'll like him. Because if you don't, then I don't know what's wrong with you. But he's a great guy, and he was a great guy. And so anyway, let's get down to it. I will tell you that in the story, when he is arrested for the crime that we immediately know he did not commit, it starts to unravel. You watch a television show, oftentimes they have flashbacks. Well, if you talk to a publisher or an agent one day that you want to work with in your writing career, they will tell you not to take too many risks. Well, that's a risk I took in doing a lot of flashbacks like you'd see in a television show. And so you don't really find out what happened to this boy until chapter 8. So I'll do some readings today, if that's okay, and tell you a little about it as we go along. So this character, Dwight Carey, he is, check it out, I'm a millennial. I got one just like you guys. So this character, Dwight Carey, he is leading this concert, the spring concert, Mozart's Requiem. This defense attorney in town, he's grown up there his whole life, his name's Ben Bailey, and he's in the choir, and he's starting to realize he doesn't fit in. He's starting to realize how people are in this town, that they're very intolerant towards things different than their own social norms, and as a result of that, he's not liking it anymore. He's about to leave his wife. We'll read you some of that. For those of you who like romance, you'll be pleased. There's a little bit of that here too. And so he's in the choir, and he's starting to reflect on his life and why he's let this town influence him so much. He doesn't feel like he's a part of it at all. How many of you have ever felt like that? You've been somewhere in your life or been a part of a group of people that you don't really feel like you belong to. And that's what Ben Bailey felt like. But needless to say, he's still trying to fit in. You know, he's still trying to fit the mold so he doesn't stand out and cause any trouble, right? And so on that same night, they go have dinner at this restaurant in town after to celebrate a great concert. And the police come in and arrest Dwight, and he has no idea why. And that is when it kind of all comes to a head. Ben Bailey has to decide what he's going to do. You know, how many of you ever confronted something like that where you realize that now You've kind of hid your thoughts about something, whether it's a passion you have or something, but you've hid your thoughts about something, and now it has come the time where you have to make a decision to say, I'm going to stand here or I'm going to stand here. And Ben Bailey has to make that decision. And it's very troublesome to him. He's built his reputation. He's built his career in this town. He doesn't know anything but this town. I never left my hometown for many, many years. And that's how, I will say, if there's anything I leaned on in creating the Ben Bailey character, it was that. For many years, I didn't think I could have a life outside of my hometown. I didn't think there was anything else out there for me. And that's not necessarily true. And sometimes you belong in your hometown. And in this case, Ben Bailey belonged right where he was. He makes a decision, a very unpopular decision, to defend Dwight Carey, who he believes is innocent. Now, what do you think the community did? Absolutely. In the worst possible way. And so, if it's okay, I'll read to you. I'm going to actually read most of chapter 6. Because I don't want to if you do want to read it, I don't want to give anything away today. But yeah, we don't want any spoilers, do we? No, spoiler alert. Not going to happen today. But I hope you'll get a chance to read this, and I'll tell you how you can later. But I want to read chapter 6 to you, because the antagonist in chapter 6, we really get to see him for the very first time. So how many of you are Harry Potter fans? Me. Star Wars too, just saying. And so, one of the things I loved about Harry Potter, first off, I never actually read the books until my fiance, Courtney, she's a huge Harry Potter fan. She said, oh, you got to read Harry Potter. You haven't done that? I said, no, I haven't. But I love Star Wars. She said, doesn't matter. So I said, okay. So she had me read Harry Potter. Oh my gosh, loved it. And I mean, I know those books came out when, the 90s? Now, I know y'all don't think I was around in the 90s because I look so young, but I was, I'm afraid to say. But I will tell you that one of the things I absolutely loved about J.K. Rowling's effort with her antagonist was how she kept the character of Voldemort so mysterious. I mean, even in the movies, if you've seen them, you don't really ever see him, but he's there. And I wanted to achieve that same thing in a probably much less, I'm sure I didn't achieve it as well as she did, but I wanted to achieve that same concept with Dr. Dan Henson. He is the metaphorical mayor of Freedom, this fictional town I've created. He runs the show. But he's not the mayor. He's a pastor of the local church. Now, before you think that I'm hating on churches, I just told you I'm a Christian. This is a message to everybody, I think. But in this town, the church is not so good. So I'm going to read chapter 6 to you, because this is where Ben has realized that most of the town is going to exile him. And he realizes there's really no turning back now. He's just been kicked out in the previous chapter from an eating establishment that he goes to all the time, simply because the front of the paper said he was going to be defending Dwight Carey. Kicked out, exiled. So not a very comfortable place for him to be. But now he's looking for an opportunity that perhaps the church will be different. Perhaps the church won't respond the same way that people did in the restaurant he was in the previous day when he got kicked out. So, here we go. Ready? All right. To Ben, Sunday mornings always looked different than any other day of the week. The same sun shone every day, but something about dawn always looked different on Sundays. Ben contemplated not going to church. Given the incident he had dealt with the day before at 3rd Street Cafe, it was a safe bet that more of the same would follow. I shouldn't show my face anywhere right now. The thought was simple enough, but he realized living in his house and office stowed away for the rest of his life would also not work. If he was going to continue to live in Freedom, he knew it was best to face the music head on. He believed Dwight was innocent, but the mounting concerns of being exiled from his hometown still bothered him. He knew nothing else. Freedom was his life. Perhaps, had he not returned to Freedom after college, his life would have been noticeably different and potentially better. This was his life now, and he knew he had to make the best of it. But after the previous morning's events, he could not fathom recovering from the embarrassment. See how infatuated this guy is with what people think? Very important thing. So Ben sat drinking his coffee in the sunroom of his custom home and wondered if he should go. He checked the church website. It said Dr. and Mrs. Henson would be out of town this Sunday and there would be a guest speaker. Perfect. For some reason, he knew he needed to go. And while he didn't feel a call to go and receive the Lord's guidance, he did want to see firsthand how the church was responding to all this. He already assumed how Dr. Henson would respond, but perhaps the church would take a stand this time for letting this play out and not turn against Dwight. If the church people were going to be like the rest of Frieden, he wanted to see it for himself. One important fundamental fact I have not noted is that Dwight also played the organ at this church. So, a coward, he thought, would avoid going to church because of what he may face. He was not sure if that was something telling him to go, was God or his own mind fooling him, but he was immersed with a feeling that inclined him to go regardless. One thing would surely be missing: Dwight Carey. For the first time in decades, Dwight would not be present at a Sunday morning worship service for Frieden Baptist Church. How would the congregation react? He longed to know. Perhaps the church will see this differently. He held church folk to a higher standard and sought validation that the church people at Frieden would be different than what he'd encountered at 3rd Street. But these people were followers of Dr. Dan Henson, and that concerned him tremendously. A pastor who, when he spoke, was listened to and obeyed regardless of whether he was right or wrong. Ben had seen firsthand over time Dr. Henson as a man who ran this town, who directed his minions to do anything he told them to do. One way or another, he had a power that was unmatched. His parents did not have the same weight in this community. They'd both passed in 1990, and while Dr. Henson was born in poverty, he had risen through the ranks of the community and had become the wealthiest and most prominent, respected man in this town. He had made the family name of Henson one of the greatest pillars of this community. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit so we can get to the meat. Isn't that what we want to do? Talking about Dr. Henson, this was the same man who claimed to represent God Almighty himself. A man who, on the day of the birth of Jesus is celebrated, invited his sister and his niece to their home for Christmas dinner, only to shout at them and force them to leave after being there for a mere 3 minutes because his niece brought her lesbian girlfriend along with her into his Christian home. This was the man who metaphorically led this town and possessed a base of followers concerningly large in number. So, Ben goes to church, okay? Now, at this point, he's still wondering how the church will react, still holding them to a higher level. Here we go. The organ usually played by Dwight for the 10 minutes prior to the start of the 11 o'clock service was not played at all. People chatted loudly in the church so much that it was deafening. Finally, the church tower bell rang. People took their seats. The congregation grew quieter. Complete silence took over. No talking, no organ, no choir. Nothing but silence. The side door next to the piano opened, and much to Ben's surprise, Dr. Dan Henson entered. Tall, lean, and dressed prominently in a suit and bow tie, covered with his black robe and adorned with a purple and gold stole, he walked directly to the pulpit. No one said a word. All eyes were on their leader. Ben suddenly did not want to be there. The awkwardness of seeing his father-in-law after leaving, I probably should tell you about that, was something he wanted to experience. And this was not something he wanted to experience. And this was exactly that. The congregation remained silent. In his commanding, deep voice that was unique to a person as imposing as he was, he spoke. King of tremendous majesty, who freely saves those worthy ones, save us, O source of mercy, from the wrath you will bestow on those who do not truly know you as the Lord God Almighty. Today is a different day at Frieden Baptist Church. Something is missing. He walked away from the podium, pacing along the stage. The first thing that is missing is a boy. A young man who was very active in this church. He was a part of the youth group and youth missions, was the son of a great Christian family in Dale and Lucy Jones, also prominent members of our church, and he's now gone to be on with the Lord. Yet his family, they questioned many things now, I'm sure. He turned back in the other direction, staying on stage. My God, why have you forsaken me? The verse from Psalms 22:1 that Jesus repeated on the cross is the very thing Dale said to me, the father, when I met with the family yesterday morning at their home. I reminded him of another passage from the book of Revelation. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be no mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. All right, so let's take just stop for a moment and say, is anything wrong with what this guy's saying? I mean, look, even if you're not a Christian, he is practicing his faith, right? There's nothing wrong with anything he said so far. I think at the end of the day, it's how he ultimately uses it that's troublesome. All right, so let's skip forward, and then I'll read this part to you. That is probably one of my favorite parts of the book, simply because it creates a tension between the protagonist, Ben Bailey, and the antagonist, Dr. Henson, in a setting where you would not expect it. Of course, remember, we are at the church. But for our church, we haven't just lost young Braxton. We've lost quite a bit in these last few days. Someone who our church revered with high regard has betrayed you, the church, and subsequently he's betrayed Jesus Christ. He continued to slowly pace on the pulpit. Ideally, we would have already lined someone up today to play the organ, have someone direct the choir, show the church and the community that we won't skip a beat. He looked down, arms behind him, still pacing. Yes, that is what most churches would do. That's the decisions most pastors would make. But not I. No, I want you to see what it looks like when there's a gaping hole in the body of Christ. Moving forward, Ben leaned back in his pew and rolled his eyes. He was not surprised at Dr. Henson's monologue, just disappointed at the number of people nodding their heads in affirmation. I will not read that word in the public library. He suspected it all along, but he just could not understand how people already believed Dwight was undoubtedly guilty. Some of the parts I skipped, he was shaking his, of course the crowd, amen, shaking their heads. Dr. Henson nodded slowly. But hasn't Dwight always reminded us of what it looks like to defy God? We all know Dwight practiced homosexuality for years. He was, and clearly still is, a troubled sexual deviant who took advantage of his stature and murdered a child when he couldn't get what he wanted from the boy. We truly may never know all the sinful acts he committed, right here in the confines of our church, or on the grounds of the school he taught in. Let's see. I'm trying not to bore you to tears. He stepped back to the podium in his pulpit. Dwight Carey will get justice when the wrath of God rains down on him and he is sentenced to an eternity of fire and hell. The congregation bowed their heads. Ben could not stop looking at Dr. Henson. As a man of God, he should have delivered a much different message. He knew Dr. Henson never liked Dwight anyway. He was as radically fundamental as they came and had long opposed Dwight's service as music director. He never let it be known in public, but in conversations Ben had overheard in the past, Dr. Henson had made it very clear that he wished Dwight would resign and leave. Ben thought for sure that with such a damning message, the choir members who knew Dwight might speak up. People who knew the real Dwight and worked with him every week knew him better, and he thought they would at least speak up and err on the side of caution that possibly a terrible mistake had been made. No dissent came. No one said a word. They just listened to what Dr. Henson had to say and nodded as if they agreed. Heavenly Father, Dr. Henson started praying, we are not worthy to serve you. God of mercy and grace, forgive us of our sins. Show us your way. Teach us to be your servants. Ben kept staring at him, and suddenly, Dr. Henson opened his eyes and looked Ben straight in his eyes. He was about 40 feet away, but Ben did not doubt in the least bit that Dr. Henson was staring directly at him. He continued to pray aloud as the two stared at one another. Father, I know there are people here today that are lost. They're in a storm like they have never been before. He paused, continuing to stare at Ben, and they have no idea what life is about to throw their way. He paused again and then slowly said, no idea. Ben felt his heart racing. Clearly, Dr. Henson's message was intended for him. With his eyes wide open and still staring at Ben, Dr. Henson said, Lord, be with them. Show them that they are wrong to think their way is just. Show them, O Lord, that they are making a grave mistake. Probably shouldn't have an interaction like that in church. Can we agree? So I think it's fair to say that Dr. Henson, even in that segment, rushed to judgment, didn't give the man a chance, and it's all because of his identity. Opinion? Maybe. Mine? Yes. So what ends up happening, and without giving too much away, obviously Ben recognizes that the church is not going to be any different than the community. They are the outside community. They're following exactly what this man is saying. And ultimately, a lot happens in the process. There's a young woman. I like writing about strong, independent women. Now, the publishing industry will tell me, I'm a straight white man. I probably shouldn't be speaking from the voice of a woman. Well, and I get that, but I like writing about strong, independent women because they have a tremendous place in our society, and it's visible more now than it ever has been. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And so one of the characters that you're introduced to is Kate Gregory. And Kate ends up, she's an assistant district attorney. She moves to town from Charlotte. She's got this quaint little southern town that she's going to move to and have this happy life. And at first, at face value, it looks like a really nice town. But what does she end up doing? She ends up finding the truth. You ever seen the movie All the King's Men, 2006, Sean Penn? One of my favorite lines from that movie is, time brings all things to light. And soon, time brought to light to Kate, this town isn't what she thought it was. When she sees her boss, the district attorney, actually meddle with the DNA report and have it changed by the state examiner's office to fit the prosecution's case, she says, no way, something's wrong. I can't stand for that unethical behavior. And so, in something you probably wouldn't see in a criminal trial, Kate ends up assisting Ben. She can't work for him. That's totally wrong. You can't do that. But she ends up assisting Ben, and they fall in love. Isn't that wonderful? So I'm not a romance writer, but I tried to achieve some romance in this book, so we'll see if I was accomplished. But nonetheless, most people have enjoyed it. But Kate ends up helping Ben in the trial. And what really blows the top on this is everybody's got a local newspaper, right? We have a local newspaper here. What is it? Anybody know Rockingham Now? I think it's called. Used to be the Reedsville Review, I believe. Yeah. And so the Richmond Observer she was talking about earlier, I actually started, that's a digital imprint in the southeastern part of the state. And so it's grown tremendously, but it's the same concept. It's a local paper. And if we came out with a story today in the local paper that was speaking out against somebody prominent in the community, do you think that would be looked at badly? Yes. Thank you. Great answer. Ding, ding. Yes, it would. And unfortunately, that happens in journalism sometimes. If the big name people do the wrong thing, we got to tell the story, right? In this town, and many towns like it, let's be honest, the paper prints what the bosses say to print. So naturally, Dwight's not really looked highly upon in the paper. Would you think that's probably right? Yeah. And so what ultimately happens that turns this thing loose is the editor of the paper, who's really trying to move up in the ranks of journalism, but here he is working in this small town with the paper and not knowing if it's ever going to really get him anywhere, is confronted with the story that the DNA report was altered to implicate Dwight. And he also has to decide what he's going to do. So with Ben and Kate's help, a story comes out at the end of chapter 13 that blows the gasket off this thing. Because the small town has kept the story in the small town. The next chapter opens Anderson Cooper's reporting live from Freedom. Anybody ever heard of Anderson Cooper? If you haven't, he is probably the most recognizable television nightly news anchor for CNN. Okay? So when CNN shows up to town, things have really blown up, okay? How many times have you seen CNN here in Wentworth or Reedsville? Hope you don't. Not many. So the point is that nothing too bad has happened here, right? That's when they're coming. Obviously, it was bad news. So do you think this is something Dr. Henson and his cronies wanted to happen? No. They don't want national attention on this story. And so we get into the trial. I don't want to give away too much, but as you can imagine, things don't work out real well for Dwight, even though the evidence does not stack up against him. And there's a story out there that Dwight, that the DNA report was altered. Does that sound a little fishy? Yes. And so because of that, the trial is as ludicrous as the arrest was. And in many ways, the witness testimony really seems to contradict the prosecution's own case. Now, without giving it away, you may or may not be wondering who killed him. I want to tell you the big difference in what I've written and what I'll probably write from here on out. How many of you have heard of John Grisham? So John Grisham is probably one of the most recognized thriller writers, authors in the probably world today. A big name. You'll see him if you go to Walmart or Barnes & Noble. You'll see his latest release. And so he writes thrillers. And almost every one of them have this same kind of outline. Different story, but same thing, same process, same structure. So when I wrote this, I was trying to change the world. What's the average age in here? Yeah, I think we said 14, 15. Yeah, so any 16? So all 14, 15, okay. So you're at a place in your life where you probably want to do something to change the world, maybe, or maybe you will be. Good for you. Don't let a soul tell you you can't, okay? Now, I grew up in a town smaller than this, and I am bound and determined that I'm going to do some good for this world. So if anybody ever tells you no, find me on my website and email me. I'll get you back on track, okay? Because the reality is you can do what you want. I can't tell you how many people told me that I wouldn't write a book. Well, there it is. And I'm not patting myself on the back, but you can do whatever you want, okay? That's one thing that I didn't plan on saying today, but since we have such a young audience, why not, right? And we're filming, so everybody else needs to hear this too, right? So here's the thing. I'm going to keep writing. And so all I ever really wanted to do was write a book, but now I want to keep writing. Let me tell you about what's happened. As a matter of fact, you've got somebody right here in the building that spoke before me. She introduced me, that has had tremendous success. I mean, she's done something that a lot of authors never get an opportunity to do, and that's be represented by an agent and picked up by one of the biggest publishers in the United States. It's okay I'm sharing all this, but HarperCollins, Harper Voyager publishes her genre. That's a big deal. Teresa was just up here. She should be speaking. She has had tremendous, tremendous success in that regard. And she's right here. You could see her every day. And so don't let anybody tell you that you've got to be in New York City or you've got to be in Los Angeles to be successful. And if you get there, great, wonderful. But you just remember, you can be successful anywhere. And that is not a waste of your time to say that. You need to know that. Because people I grew up with, and even me at one point, thought that would never happen. I'd never have the opportunity to do some of the things I've done. Okay? So now we got that out of the way. Let's talk about the book again. A week and a half ago, I went to New York City to a pitch conference. I met an executive editor with HarperCollins. She's already there. I'm trying to get there, right? I met an executive editor at HarperCollins. I met 3 agents. Loved them. Especially one, but loved them. And I met St. Martin's Press. They were interested in this book that 6 or 7 months ago, even when I knew it was coming out, nobody cared about. So you can achieve, and you can do something like this too if you want to. This story I'm so passionate about, and the reason I'm passionate about it is because, one, the message means something to me. Now, when I went to this conference, the editors are they're very, and you probably can relate to this, Teresa, but they're very brash, very just honest, in the boldest kind of way. And so I told them, what the book was about, and they're like, well, if we print it, because I'm hoping to re-release it under maybe with a little different revisions, some revisions that would make the storyline different than a little bit what I've told you today. But they're interested in it. They want to look at some revisions, what have you. And I said, okay, we could do that. They wanted me to change the ending. I said, I can't change the ending. So you have to draw the line somewhere, right? We got to stand for something or we'll fall for anything. And so I drew the line on the ending. I said, it's got to stay that way. And they said, okay, so if it stays that way, that's fine. But it was just an amazing experience to see this transition into what could be a big deal maybe one day. But right now, It's done really well, and I've enjoyed the experience. I've had 9 book signings. I'm very tired from traveling, but it's been an amazing experience to go out and do book talks and stuff like this. But I have to be honest with you, you guys are the youngest crowd that I've spoken to, and it is refreshing to know that people your age are interested in reading. But if you like thrillers, that's what this book is ultimately. It took me a while to realize that even though I wanted this to be literary fiction, meaning fiction that is above, if you will, commercial fiction in a sense that it's trying to, or has a message of significant meaning, I wanted it to be that, but I think it's a thriller. It's taken me time to realize that. And if I re-release it, it's going to have to be a thriller, or they won't work with me, it sounds like. But I'm not trying to sell myself, but I do want to get a contract and to work with an agent and a big name publisher like one of your very own has done right here at Rockingham Community College. So anyway, so that's the story, and I don't want to give away the ending, but I did want to read that part to you. I will tell you something if you read this, and I want to be very, very brief about this. At the end of the day, 2 things. I identified the antagonist as Dr. Henson because even though a lot of authors like to make this group collectively the antagonist, that's a risk, and they like to say they did it. The reality is Frieden, the people of Frieden, are pawns. They follow everything this man says blindly, and they realize that at the end, a lot of them. They realize that they may not change their feeling about Dwight being gay. Hey, if that's something they feel strongly about, okay, fine. But they have to start considering these preconceived notions of how to treat people that they've always had, you know. How many of you read A Time to Kill or heard of A Time to Kill? Yeah, there we go. I can't tell you how many times I heard that when I was in New York. They're like, this is a time to kill. What is A Time to Kill meets what? You know, I said, I don't know. But it's very A Time to Kill, where in the rural South, I think Mississippi, this man might correct me in the back, I believe it's a trial that ensues in Mississippi, and it's very racially charged. And let's be honest, the fact that people's sexual identity are not the only issues between peoples that we're facing today. We still have a racial crisis, I think, in many parts of this country. And to me, that's as much a problem. You know, I chose a gay man and really took a risk in doing so. Hey, I'm from a small town too, folks. I didn't know how these people were going to respond. My hometown people, I didn't know how they were going to respond. Are they going to read this and say, well, you know, shame on him? Well, it's been received well for the most part, but I took a risk. I took a stand for something I believe in. I believe we ought to treat people the same, period. And that's a message I'm passionate about. Now, when I went to New York, they told me, oh, you're too political. They said, yeah, tone it down a notch. They said, just tell us a good story. And so if I ever re-release this, it'll be much more of a thriller, much less of a political front. But I'm still going to say the same thing. May just not be as much in your face about it. Because I think good writing, I really believe one of the things I failed in with this edition, good writing, they can tell what you had to say without you saying it. And that is one thing I'm going to make better in the next edition. Hopefully it'll come out one day if I ever get you never know, but if I ever get an opportunity to publish with a big publisher, which would be a blessing, it'll be released that way. And hopefully be really successful. So we'll see. So I can't tell you how it ended, but some of you are going to like it, some of you aren't. But check it out. I hope you'll read it. If anybody wants a copy of the book, so guess what? I found out I was going to actually give out copies today, but she's like, what? You gonna? I said, yeah. All right, so here's what I was going to do. I was going to give out copies today, but I'll tell you what I'll do. How many have we got in here? If I can get a number, I'm going to give everybody in here a copy at some point and sign it for you. And I sold out at an event I had. I didn't realize I sold out. You know, I had, you asked me, and literally this is the book in my possession. And I have hardbacks. I don't have any of them right now, so hardcover. So if anybody wants a book, let somebody know here at the library or whatever. I'll be happy to provide a student a book so you can check it out. And I hope you'll enjoy it. So yeah, that's my story, and that's the reason I wrote this book, and it's very special to me. And so, do you have any questions? Is it okay if I? Oh, perfect, perfect. Yeah, yeah.
I was wondering, why did straight man?
Yeah, so two reasons. One, kind of what I touched on, is that I knew this man, and even though it's not the same man, in many ways his story has always been special to me and inspired me. So that's probably the number one reason. The other reason that I chose that is because we have a lot of books, I think, that tackle racial issue. Time to Kill tackled a racial issue. And we've seen film. To Kill a Mockingbird, probably the most famous of them all, has stood the test of time and is still relevant today. While we may not have a situation like we had in the 1960s and 70s or earlier in the American South, we still face racial issues all across the country, not limited to the American South. And so I really didn't want to go there, but I think the message is the exact same, in my opinion. Some people may not feel that way. I do. I think identity, no matter what, should not be a target for people who don't understand it. I think we ought to have a little more empathy and try to understand. So that's why I chose this. One, because it was personal, obviously because of the man I knew. And two, because I wanted to take a new spin on it and show that we have the same issue in a lot of areas. But I could have easily used any other situation. Black, white, race, ethnicity, culture. I could have used a number of things. I just simply chose that because it's a symbol for our misunderstanding of people different than us. Great question. That's a great question.
Can you explain what everything on the book cover represents?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Great question. By the way, can I just say, I know the folks that are watching can't see this, but I absolutely love your T-shirt. I'm a huge fan of The Office. So he's asking about the book cover. This was the first actual design that I saw, and I fell in love with it. Now, you all may think, you may be thinking, well, it is terrible, but maybe you're not, but I absolutely loved it. And I will touch on it. So you see the music notes in the back. Mozart's Requiem, very, very famous classical piece. And its deathly themes, it was actually believed that Mozart wrote it for his own funeral. Requiem is a mass for the dead, Catholic mass for the dead. And so the underlying gloomy themes really fit this, right? This is a dark time in freedom. And so I wanted the book to look dark, but not obviously I didn't want it to be like a solid black background or anything like that. I wanted to have some character that would come out. And so, but notice the darkness. I love the town in black, the silhouette of the town. But the music notes really were, and just a preference, but the dark red background, and notice what towers over everything else. I know our folks we're watching this on YouTube or on the website can't see, but the church is towering over everything. And here's the thing, that's okay, but in this town it's not. In this town it has a terrible influence, and so I wanted that to be prominent. And then you have the stairways, of course, with the that look like the organ or the piano. And then you're left to determine who the man is. And you'll have to read the book to see who the man, what the man's doing. But I think it'll be very clear to you at the ending. I wanted the book to encompass everything I was trying to say. That may be a rookie mistake. I don't know, because it's my first novel. But when I saw this design, I saw several others, but I kept coming back to this one because I just loved how gloomy and dark and relative to the story I thought it was. That's a great question. Ask away if you shall. Yes. Love your shirt too, by the way.
Thank you. So why did you decide that it would be set in modern times rather than the 50s or 60s when this was more of a problem?
Yeah. You know what? That's a great question, because I'm going to tell you, it has been worse of a problem before now. Now, when I'm talking about a problem, I'm talking about our ability to relate to different people, or people who have different sexual identities. So that's what I'm talking about. Not sure if you're referring to that or not. But in the 50s and 60s, we have a very detailed accounts of what went on then. What I wanted to show is that it is still a pertinent issue now. I was in New York in June also, and it was amazing to me. You know, you walk around where I'm from, and you don't see people, you know, flying pride flags. No, absolutely not. You would never see that, very candidly. But in New York, you do. Why is that? Because I think in other areas, and I'm not picking on the South here. I love the South. Lived there my whole life. But I think in certain areas, it is hardly a problem at all anymore. And you have a very fair point. Where it was a problem in the 60s. Stonewall Inn riots. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but I was in the Greenwich Village of New York. Police came and just beat up, I think it was mostly gay men, at a Stonewall Inn nightclub. No relevant reason. And since then, the city of New York has actually issued this year an apology, finally, for that incident. So you're absolutely right that it was much more of a problem before now. But the reality is, and what I wanted to show, is that there are still pockets of America and the world that we still have these same problems. Yeah. So that's a great question. I hope I answered it.
Anybody else? Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an
all.
absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.